The sky above Jerusalem turned a bruised, ominous dark. A heavy, suffocating blanket smothered the city, dimming the light until the horizon vanished into charcoal gray. High above the rooftops, the air grew thick, stagnant, and cold. Then, the ground beneath the city shifted. A low, mournful tremor ran through the earth, vibrating upward through stone foundations and dirt paths alike. It was not a sudden jolt, but a deep, rolling groan that seemed to rise from the very core of the world. Birds stopped mid-flight. The wind died in the trees. The usual bustle of the marketplace ceased, leaving a void where the rhythm of daily life had been. In that sudden, unnatural hush, the only sounds that remained were the distant, ragged cries of a few women echoing against the limestone walls. The city held its breath, trapped in a stillness that felt both final and expectant. Every shadow stretched longer, deepening the gloom that clung to the streets. There was no escape from the weight of the atmosphere. It pressed down on the rooftops, on the narrow alleys, and on the hearts of those who stood frozen in the streets. The gaze of the city turned upward, drawn toward the summit of Golgotha. Against the bruised, charcoal sky, a single figure stood silhouetted on the hill. It was the man they called Jesus. Only days before, he had walked the dusty paths of Galilee, touching the sick, restoring sight to the blind, and speaking words that had quieted the storms of the heart. Now, he hung suspended between the earth and the darkening heavens. His body was a map of exhaustion, held in place by the weight of his own frame. Every movement was a battle against gravity. His breath came in ragged, shallow gasps that tore through the stillness of the hill. Each inhalation was a deliberate, agonizing effort, a testament to the suffering that had pushed him to the very edge of endurance. There was no sound of healing now, no gentle voice offering peace to the weary. There was only the rhythmic, strained labor of lungs fighting for air. He remained fixed, a solitary point of focus in a world that had ceased its movement to watch. The contrast was absolute. The hands that had once reached out to comfort were now stilled, pinned in place. The voice that had commanded the wind was reduced to the sound of a man struggling. The memory of the last few hours hung in the air, thick and violent. Before he was raised, there had been the whips. They had torn through flesh with rhythmic, calculated precision. Each strike had left its mark, a map of cruelty etched into his skin. He had been dragged through the streets, shoved forward by iron-fisted guards who cared nothing for the man they pushed. Then came the mockery. A crown of thorns was forced into his brow, the points biting deep, drawing blood that traced slow lines down his face. The crowd had gathered, not to help, but to jeer. They had hailed him as a king, their voices dripping with venomous sarcasm. They spat at his feet and laughed as he stumbled under the weight of his own burden. The people he had healed, the ones who had once hung on his every word, now stood at a distance. Their faces were masks of cold, hard indifference. They watched his agony with the detached curiosity of spectators at a game. He was utterly rejected, cast out by the very ones he had come to save. The betrayal was absolute, a sharper pain than the iron or the wood. The final, agonizing seconds ticked by with a slowness that felt like hours. The air on the hill grew thin, heavy with the weight of the coming end. His chest rose and fell in shallow, jagged rhythms, each breath a desperate fight against the encroaching dark. Then, the rhythm broke. He shifted. With a strength that defied his broken state, he pulled his body upward, straining against the wood. The movement was sharp, sudden, and absolute. He lifted his head. His eyes scanned the horizon, not with the look of a victim, but with the gaze of someone who had reached the end of a long, arduous journey. He drew in one final, deep, lungful of air. His voice cut through the stillness of the hill, clear and resonant, carrying a weight that forced the wind to pause. "It is finished." The words hung in the air, a final, resolute seal on everything that had come before. Then, the tension left his frame. His head dropped forward. The silence that followed was not merely an absence of sound. It was a crushing, absolute void. The whimpering of the women nearby was the only thing left in the world. He was gone. The earth seemed to stop its rotation, holding its breath in the wake of the silence. The end had arrived, and it was total. The silence on the hill did not lift. It settled, heavy and suffocating, over the small group of followers. Hope, which had burned with such intensity only days before, was now a cold, gray ash. The disciples stood frozen, their eyes fixed on the empty space where their leader had been. There was no movement, no plan, no direction. Fear had replaced their faith, a sharp, biting cold that made their hands tremble and their voices fail. They huddled together in the shadow of the hill, pressing close as if proximity could shield them from the reality of the loss. Every face was a map of confusion. They looked at one another, searching for a sign, a word, anything to bridge the gap. The future they had built in their minds, a future of promise, had been torn away in an instant. It lay in pieces at their feet. The dream was gone. The path they had walked for years had reached a dead end, and they realized they were truly alone. They moved with a mechanical, hollow precision. Grief had stripped away their ability to speak, leaving only the necessity of the task. They approached the site, their hands trembling as they reached out to touch the cold, still form. They wrapped him in clean linen, pulling the fabric tight with slow, reverent motions. Every fold was a final goodbye. Every touch, a desperate attempt to hold on to what was already lost. They carried him to the nearby tomb, a dark, narrow opening carved deep into the limestone. The air inside was stagnant, smelling of dry earth and ancient stone. They laid him down on the rock shelf, their movements heavy with the weight of their shattered purpose. Then, they stepped back into the light of the dying day. They pushed against the massive, circular stone. It groaned, a jagged, grinding sound that echoed off the canyon walls. It moved an inch, then two, until it finally slammed into place with a dull, final thud. The entrance was gone. The darkness inside was absolute. Outside, the Roman guards stepped forward, their metal gear clanking in the sudden quiet. They took their positions, eyes fixed on the stone, unyielding and cold. The first day began not with light, but with a heavy, suffocating stillness that clung to the city. The sun climbed over the horizon, casting long, sharp shadows across the tomb, yet it brought no warmth to the hearts of those who remained. The air felt thin, drained of all vitality. Hours bled into one another, measured only by the slow rotation of the earth. There was no movement from the stone. No sound emerged from the dark interior. The world seemed to have paused, caught in the grip of an absolute, unyielding finality. Every time the sun reached its peak and began its long descent, the followers looked toward the hill, hoping for a shift, a sign, a whisper of life. But the light faded into a bruised twilight, and the darkness returned, just as cold and just as empty as before. The silence was not merely an absence of sound. It was a physical weight, pressing down on the city, pressing down on the tomb, and pressing down on the spirits of those who had once believed. As the first day ended, the stillness remained unbroken, a deafening testament to the void left behind. The hope they had carried was now buried deep beneath the earth. The second day arrived with a pale, sickly light that offered no solace. The sun traced the same path across the sky, indifferent to the grief that had settled over the city like a shroud. At the tomb, the guards remained, their bodies rigid, their eyes fixed on the stone. They did not shift, they did not speak, they did not blink. Their presence was a wall of cold, unyielding reality that defied any flicker of hope. In the city, the disciples stayed hidden, their movements slow and labored, as if the air itself had grown thick and difficult to breathe. They sat in the dim corners of their rooms, staring at the floor, their minds replaying the final moments on the hill. Every sound from the street, a distant cart, a stray dog, a gust of wind made them flinch, but nothing ever changed. The silence of the second day was deeper than the first, a heavy, suffocating blanket that seemed to drain the very color from the world. Hope had not just faded, it had been replaced by a hollow, aching numbness. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the shadows stretched, leaving them in the dark. The third day began in the same gray, muted light that had defined the previous two. The air was thin, tasting of dust and the lingering chill of the night. Across the city, the silence remained absolute, a heavy shroud that seemed to have settled permanently over the streets and the stone-walled dwellings. Near the tomb, the guards stood in their fixed positions, their breathing shallow and rhythmic, their eyes scanning the horizon for any movement that did not exist. The world felt suspended, caught in a cycle of stillness that had no end. But as the first faint, pale hints of dawn began to bleed into the eastern sky, the atmosphere underwent a subtle, inexplicable change. It was not a shift in light, but a shift in the very foundation of the earth. A low, rhythmic vibration began to pulse beneath the ground, so faint it could have been mistaken for the beating of a heart. It traveled through the soil, vibrating against the soles of the guards' feet, though they remained motionless, unaware of the approaching disruption. The air grew charged, static prickling against the skin. The deep, heavy silence was no longer empty. It was waiting. The tremor deepened, a subtle, rhythmic thrumming that signaled the end of the long, oppressive stillness. The vibration ceased to be a pulse and became a violent, jarring heave. The earth buckled. The ground beneath the tomb site surged upward, throwing the guards from their feet. They scrambled, arms flailing, trying to find purchase on the shifting soil, but the tremor was relentless. It tore through the silence, with a roar that echoed off the surrounding rock faces. Then, the sound of grinding stone shattered the air. The massive stone, which had been immovable for 2 days, began to slide. It did not roll slowly. It was propelled by a force that defied all physical resistance. It skidded across the uneven ground, sparks flying as rocks scraped against rock, until it slammed to a halt, fully clearing the entrance. The guards lay sprawled in the dust, their eyes wide, chests heaving, staring at the dark, gaping mouth of the tomb. The guards scrambled backward, scrambling on hands and knees, unable to look away from the empty, dark space where the barrier had been. The first light of dawn touched the ridge as the women climbed the path toward the tomb. They moved with a heavy, rhythmic purpose, their hands clutching the jars of spices intended for the final rites. The air was still cool, carrying the scent of damp earth and the lingering dust from the night's tremor. As they rounded the final bend, they stopped. The path ahead was clear, but the tomb was not. The massive stone, which had been sealed tight, lay shifted to the side, leaving a dark, jagged opening in the rock face. They froze. The jars in their hands felt suddenly heavy, their weight pulling at their arms. They stepped closer, their boots crunching on the loose gravel, eyes fixed on the dark void where the barrier should have been. One woman reached out, her fingers brushing the cold, rough edge of the stone, then pulled back as if burned. They peered into the shadows of the tomb. The stone slab inside was bare. The linen cloths were there, but the space where he had been laid was empty. A sharp, sudden intake of breath echoed in the silence. The grief that had driven them here began to fracture, replaced by a cold, rising tide of bewilderment. The silence inside the tomb was not empty. It held a weight that pressed against the air, thick and expectant. The women stood paralyzed, their breath hitching in their throats as they stared into the gloom. One took a tentative step forward, her hand reaching out to steady herself against the cold rock wall. Then, the stillness broke. A voice, clear and resonant, emerged from the shadows deep within the chamber. It did not sound like a ghost or a whisper. It carried the steady, grounded tone of a living man. The women recoiled, their shoulders jerking back in unison as the sound vibrated against the stone. "Why do you look for the living among the dead?" The question hung in the air, sharp and undeniable. It forced them to stop their frantic searching, to stand still and listen. The voice continued, firm yet gentle, cutting through the fog of their grief. He is not here. He has risen. The words hit them with the force of a physical blow. The impossible truth echoed off the cavern walls. The heavy, stagnant air of the tomb seemed to thin, replaced by a sudden, sharp clarity. The women stood in the threshold, their hands trembling, the jars of spices clattering as they hit the stone floor. The grief that had been a crushing weight for 3 days began to fracture, the jagged edges of their despair smoothing out under the pressure of an impossible truth. Death, which had felt like an absolute, final wall, was now nothing more than a broken barrier. A surge of energy, vibrant and warm, flooded the space, chasing away the chill of the grave. It was as if the very ground beneath their feet had shifted, realigning the world into a new, terrifyingly beautiful shape. Their hearts, once heavy with the leaden burden of loss, began to race with a frantic, wild rhythm. Hope was no longer a distant, flickering memory. It was a fire, roaring back to life with a power that defied every law of nature. The darkness that had smothered the city since the cross began to recede, pushed back by an unseen, brilliant light. The women looked at each other, their faces transformed from masks of sorrow into vessels of wonder. The light intensified, spilling from the entrance of the tomb until it seemed to occupy every corner of the space. Then, the figure stepped forward. He did not emerge as a shadow or a flicker of light, but as a man of substance, his feet pressing firmly into the dust of the path. The women drew back, their breath catching in their throats, their eyes tracing the form before them. He was there, tangible and real, the morning sun catching the lines of his face. He held his hands out, the skin broken by the marks of his ordeal. Yet he did not move with the hesitation of a wounded man. He spoke, and his voice was the same one that had calmed the storms and healed the broken, now carrying the weight of total victory. The women fell to their knees, not in terror, but in a sudden, overwhelming recognition. He stood before them, radiating a peace that reached out and settled into their very bones, anchoring them to the truth of his return. The news did not stay within the tomb. It surged outward, finding the disciples where they huddled behind locked doors, their bodies curled tight against the walls. For days, they had been ghosts in their own lives, paralyzed by the memory of the cross. Then the women arrived, their voices shaking with the impossible truth. The disciples looked up, their faces pale and drawn. But as the words settled, the atmosphere in the room shifted. The fear that had acted like a leaden weight on their chests began to dissolve. One by one, they stood. The tremor in their hands ceased. They moved to the doors and threw them open, letting the morning light flood the cramped, stale air of their hiding place. The hesitation that had defined their every movement vanished. They were no longer the men who had scattered into the shadows. They were something else entirely. Their eyes, once clouded by confusion and dread, now burned with a singular, unshakable focus. They gathered their belongings with swift, decisive motions, their movements fluid and purposeful. The terror that had kept them silent was replaced by a sudden, driving need to speak. They stepped out into the streets, not as men fleeing a threat, but as messengers carrying a fire that could not be contained. Every step was firm, every gesture deliberate, as they moved forward to share the news that had rewritten their world. The fear was gone, replaced by a courage that defied every threat, a purpose that would not be silenced. This was not merely a singular moment in time, a flash of light that faded as quickly as it arrived. It was a fundamental shift in the architecture of existence. The resurrection acted as a beacon, a permanent marker. No matter how deep the night, no matter how heavy the shadows that press against the spirit, light is an inevitable force. It does not ask for permission to break through. It simply arrives. For those who feel adrift, lost in a sea of uncertainty, this truth serves as a compass. It dictates that there is always a path back, a way to navigate out of the silence. The darkness that feels absolute, the despair that seems to have the final word, these are not the end of the story. The message is etched into the very fabric of the world, constant and unyielding. It promises that what is broken can be mended. This is the pulse of the resurrection, a rhythm that beats beneath the surface of every struggle, ensuring the way forward is always present. Consider your own life in this quiet moment. What sits behind the heavy stone of your own experience? Perhaps it is a hope that withered under the weight of repeated disappointment. Maybe it is a peace that vanished, replaced by the constant, grinding noise of anxiety. Or perhaps you feel a direction you once held firmly has slipped away, leaving you standing in a maze of choices where every path feels blocked. You look at these areas of your life and see only a tomb, a place where something vital has ceased to breathe. You see the stone, immovable and cold, sealing away the future you once envisioned. But look closer at that stone. It was not meant to be a permanent barrier. The same force that shattered the silence of that first morning is not confined to the pages of history. It is a kinetic, living reality that moves through the present. It acts upon the very things you have deemed dead or beyond repair. The stillness you feel is not the end of the story. It is the moment before the shift. The power that moved the earth, that forced the stone to roll away, is active now, pressing against the boundaries of your own circumstances. You look at the silence in your life and call it a final curtain call. You see the closed doors, the stalled ambitions, and the quiet spaces where laughter used to live, and you decide the story is finished. But this perspective is a mistake. What you perceive as the absolute end is often the quiet, heavy prelude to a new beginning. It is the moment before the dawn breaks the horizon. Consider the stone at the tomb. It was not a wall. It was a temporary barrier, waiting to be moved. Your current circumstances, no matter how stagnant or cold they feel, are not a permanent state. The same power that defied the laws of nature to turn a grave into a doorway is still at work. It is not too late for your own narrative to be rewritten. The ink is not dry. The chapters you thought were closed can be reopened, transformed by a force that specializes in resurrection. This is not a promise of a return to what was, but an invitation to something entirely new. When you stop viewing your struggles as a dead end and start seeing them as the ground for a new chapter. If this message has found its way into your heart today, know that it was not by accident. You are standing at a point of decision. You can walk away and let the weight of your circumstances settle back over you. Or you can choose to hold on to this light. Subscribe to Just Jesus Word. Make this connection a part of your daily rhythm. It is a simple step, but it keeps the door open to the same power that rolled away the stone. Do not let the noise of the world drown out the truth you have heard. Keep your focus on the promise of renewal. Keep your heart open to the possibility of a rewritten chapter. There is a peace available to you that defies all logic, a quiet strength that remains. Carry this truth with you. Peace be with you.